So welcome everyone to the Asian American Cultural Center and the Asian American Studies lecture series. It's really wonderful to have so many of you here on a Thursday afternoon. I know there's a lot going on, so we're all very grateful for your presence today. So first, of course, I want to thank the Center for Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration for supporting this wonderful lecture series. And I'm just really thrilled to be bringing back two of our alumni from the Yale American Studies program, Professors Simeon Man and Elizabeth Son. So I'm going to give quick introductions to the two of them, and then I'm going to turn it over to hear about their wonderful work. So Professor Mann is an assistant professor of history at the University of California at San Diego. He's an affiliate faculty member of the Department of Ethnic Studies and the program in Critical Gender Studies. He specializes in Asian American history and transnational U.S. history with a focus on the politics of race and empire. He received his PhD in American Studies at Yale in 2012 and graduated from the University of Washington, where he received his BA. And before joining the faculty at UC San Diego, he was an Andrew W. Mellon postdoctoral fellow at Northwestern from 2012 to 2014, and also a provost postdoctoral scholar in the humanities at the University of Southern California, and that was from 2014 to 2015. So we're going to be hearing about his first book, Soldiering Through Empire, Race in the Making of the Decolonizing Pacific, which just came out from the University of California Press last year, 2018. It's a cultural history of the U.S. military in Asia and the Pacific after World War II, and the book explains how the United States mobilized citizens from nations and territories throughout the region for the U.S. war in Vietnam. And particularly the work really reconsiders this question of soldiering as labor, as military labor, civilian labor, forms of labor that's critical to the expansion of the American empire post-war. And Professor Elizabeth Son will be following Simeon Man, and she's an associate professor, recently tenured at Northwestern University. She completed her American Studies PhD a year before Professor Mann in 2011. So she has a courtesy appointment. She's an associate professor of theater at Northwestern University. She holds courtesy appointments in the Department of Performance Studies, Asian American Studies, and the program in American Studies. She's an interdisciplinary scholar whose research focuses on the interplay between histories of gender-based violence and contemporary performance in the United States and South Korea. Her book, which we'll be hearing from, Embodied Reckonings, Comfort Women, Performance, and Transpacific Redress, is from the University of Michigan Press, also 2018, and examines the political and cultural aspects of contemporary performances in South Korea, Japan, and the United States that have grappled with the history of Japanese military sexual slavery. Her scholarly articles have appeared in Asian Theater Journal, Theater Survey, Theater, and many others. And she's also a public scholar. She writes op-eds, which have appeared in such publications as the Los Angeles Review of Books and The Hill. Both scholars have garnered awards for their amazing, groundbreaking scholarship, and we're delighted to have them back on campus today. So please join me in welcoming them, and the first to speak is Professor Mann.
So thank you so much, Mary, and thank you everyone for being here. It's really, really wonderful to be back in this space. This is where the project got started, being in conversation with so many people in my cohort, in our seminars. And I think it's really interesting that even though we each have our own very individual projects, I think we all, we're grappling with some broad similar questions, right? Questions that were percolating in American studies at the time, about the limits of liberalism and its promise of freedom through inclusion, right? And ways of reckoning with histories of violence and its long persistent aftermaths. So Soldiering Through Empire, which I'm going to talk about today, really grew out of these conversations. It is an attempt to wrestle with what I see as one of the central paradoxes of post-1945 U.S. imperial culture. That is, how did the United States legitimate itself as a champion of racial equality and democracy, and yet at the same time expand its state powers to wage war throughout the decolonizing world? How do we reconcile the seeming contradiction between these dueling imperatives, right, of liberal inclusion and racialized state violence? So I approached this question by turning to the military and exploring the ways that Asian soldiers were mobilized for US military projects in Asia and the Pacific, especially during the Vietnam War. In one sense, the book is an attempt to tell a history of the international Vietnam War beyond an area studies framework of Cold War history, and to think instead about the legacies of colonialism in Asia and the Pacific, and how they continue to manifest through the militarized labor of their citizens. And I look at 3 specific sites, the Philippines, South Korea, and Hawaii. In these countries and territories after World War II, we see a similar pattern of colonial subjects being liberated from colonialism to take part in US war. This process of ushering freedom through violence was at the heart of US imperialism after 1945. And I call this process the making of the decolonizing Pacific. The decolonizing Pacific is not so much a fixed geography, but rather names a historical conjuncture in which the unfinished struggles for decolonization throughout Asia and the Pacific became intertwined with and co-opted by the US imperative of securing the global capitalist economy. Asia for Asians, as a discourse and a practice, was the US response to the emerging Third World. It was an attempt to pacify anti-colonial resistance and to channel the freedom dreams of the formerly colonized into the economy of war-making. So viewed through this lens of the decolonizing Pacific, the involvement of different nations and territories in the Vietnam War tells us a larger story than the international Vietnam War. Instead, it reveals that the war was the very ground on which the struggles for an unfulfilled freedom from colonialism would be waged, contained, and radicalized. To tell this Transpacific history of soldiering, I turn to the military and examine the kinds of social relations that it facilitated among racialized subjects of US empire. In describing the post-1945 US empire, scholars have used phrases like empire of bases, archipelago of empire. As useful as these are in helping us comprehend the extensive global reach of the US military, for the most part, they've actually limited us in fully understanding how the military works. So in my account, the military is more than just a transparent essence of the US empire, whose power is seemingly self-explanatory by pointing to its size, permanence, or hidden nature. Instead, I approach the military as a site of contingency, where state power operates in far more intricate ways, blurring the boundaries between inclusion and exclusion, violence and benevolence, peacetime and wartime. In Asian American studies, the military also has been treated in somewhat one-dimensional terms as an institution that has served to incorporate ethnic minorities into the nation. This myopic view has reproduced liberal narratives of race and citizenship, of the transition from racial exclusion to national inclusion, with World War II marking the turning point. So my examination of Asian American racial formation through a Transpacific lens, specifically through the history of Asians being conscripted to work the US military empire, is an attempt to disrupt this narrative. So my argument is this, that Asian American citizenship has a genealogy in US imperial violence. Their inclusion into the nation was predicated on their mobilization to police new boundaries of exclusion elsewhere in the decolonizing world. So that's the crux of the larger project, and what I'm going to do now is to dive into parts of the book to give you a sense of the archives. Okay, so, nope. One of the early participants of the US war in Vietnam was this group of Filipinos mobilized under the name Operation Brotherhood. They were doctors and nurses who had received their medical training in US colonial institutions and whose skills and desires would get channeled into the service of the post-World War II US empire. The first contingent shown here arrived in South Vietnam in the fall of 1954, soon after the collapse of French colonial rule and the Geneva Accords divided the country. Specifically, they were mobilized by the CIA as an experiment in psychological warfare. Their task was to win the trust of the Vietnamese people and to steer them closer to the South Vietnamese government. The CIA referred to them in racializing terms. They saw them as quote-unquote free Asians who could demonstrate to the Vietnamese, quote, from one brown skin to another, what it meant to embody liberal democracy. If the Philippines was the show window of American democracy, as they were popularly known at the time, right, in Asia during the Cold War, the Filipinos of Operation Brotherhood helped convey that idea through counterinsurgency. Right, so here is an image of Dr. Antonio Velasco with this first contingent. And this is actually the kinds of images that the CIA wanted to project, right? Of Asians helping Asians, with Americans receding in the background or at most taking a secondary role. So to Americans, Operation Brotherhood was a means to an end of winning and securing the population. The actual medical remedy they provided the Vietnamese was in many ways inconsequential, and they actually openly admitted that in their reports. One report written by Edward Lansdale is revealing in this sense. So in the report, he noted that besides their medical work, the Filipinos also performed a kind of social intimacy with the Vietnamese that was crucial to the counterinsurgency. Quote, they made up their own songs, they held parties and off-duty hours, and in general were a real tonic to the dispirited. Even the presence of pretty Filipino girl doctors was enough to encourage Vietnamese to learn English so they could talk to them, end quote. So there's a picture of Edward Lansdale being kind of creepy, right? Just like standing in the background. So Edward Lansdale figures quite centrally in most historical accounts of the Philippines-Vietnam connection, right? Because he was the one who was credited with perfecting counterinsurgency tactics in the Philippines and then exporting it to South Vietnam. Historians have rightly argued that we need to move away from Lansdale because he has a tendency of overemphasizing his own influence. But at the same time, I return to his papers and his archives because I think his documents reveal what I'm calling the intimacies of counterinsurgency, right? These kinds of social relations that are otherwise occluded if we only focus on military state documents. So one of the nurses, Josefina Pablo, recalled in an interview, she said, the Vietnamese trusted us and accepted us very well. And it was this trust that made it possible for her to teach them about public health. Josefina was 25 years old when she arrived in South Vietnam in 1955. She was a recent graduate of St. Luke's Hospital School of Nursing, which was established by Americans during the colonial period. Josefina saw Operation Brotherhood as fulfilling her desire to, quote, travel and see the world, and to put to good use her nursing degree. She had no expectations of securing South Vietnam from communism. That figured far in the back of her mind. Instead, she simply considered her medical deeds on behalf of the Vietnamese her most lasting accomplishments. So this is the point that I want to emphasize. Although these Filipinos traveled to South Vietnam as educated subjects of the U.S. empire, just as Americans had intended, their interactions with the Vietnamese at times testified to a colonial intimacy of a different kind, an affection that refused to be instrumentalized, and that, at least momentarily, signaled something else beyond the counterinsurgency imperative. At the same time that it's important to recognize that their desires became channeled into the work of counterinsurgency. We also need to recognize that the U.S. project of securing Asia for Asians sowed the seeds of its own unraveling, as we'll see in a different example. So I'm going to turn now to briefly to Hawaii, because in Hawaii we also see the entanglements of liberalism and state violence at work, but also the challenge posed by anti-war and anti-colonial resistance. Like Philippine independence, Hawaii's statehood in 1959 was hailed as a gift of freedom, demonstrating the U.S. commitment to liberal democracy. And similar to how Filipinos were recruited to extend that gift to the Vietnamese, discourses of Hawaii's statehood were mobilized in the service of war. In 1965, the 25th Division, known as Hawaii's Own, deployed from Schofield Barracks in Oahu to Cu Chi District in South Vietnam. Its mission was standard counterinsurgency. Soldiers built schools and hospitals, they launched public health campaigns, and generally sought to convey their good intentions to the people. As part of their operation, the soldiers collected donations from Hawaii citizens to give to the Vietnamese. The operation was called Helping Hand, and the entire spectacle was replete with references to Hawaii's statehood. The commanding general called it an extension of our aloha to the people of Vietnam, and like Operation Brotherhood, Operation Helping Hand succeeded in large part by enacting different stories about different places, folding one narrative into another. If statehood was celebrated as the liberal inclusion of Hawaii into the US nation, then that became the narrative frame for the counterinsurgency, as the soldiers sought to incorporate the Vietnamese into a vision of domesticity that was predicated on the ongoing dispossession of Native Hawaiians of their land and sovereignty. Such liberal enactments of war could not ultimately contain the war's brutal violence. And that violence was not the result of counterinsurgency gone awry, but the logical extension of liberal warfare. So in the book, I discuss some of these examples of the kinds of racialized training that took place in Oahu, notably, so at Schofield Barracks, they created a mock Vietnamese village where soldiers trained, and I've uncovered a connection between the soldiers who trained here and the My Lai massacre that took place in 1968. So my point in making these connections is not simply to draw a causal connection, right, but to make the broader argument that liberal inclusion produces the condition for state violence and its disavowal. Racial liberalism was never simply a Cold War imperative that occasionally gets forestalled by war. Instead, war was the terrain upon which racial liberalism gained traction in the post-World War II period. So I'm going to wrap up by discussing just one more image. So this image, a map of Oahu, it was published in an underground anti-war GI publication called Liberated Barracks, based in Schofield Barracks. It introduced a critical reading of Oahu's geography, right, mimicking a tourist map and guiding readers to the less familiar sites, right, than what is presented usually in a tourist brochure. So in the top left corner, you can't really read it. It says, under scenic points of interest, it's stated, be sure to visit all U.S. military occupied lands indicated by blacked out areas. And one of these blacked out areas was the My Lai, what they called the My Lai Jungle Training Center, or so pointing the reader's gaze to the middle of the island, the text revealed Hawaii's Little Vietnam as the genesis of the 1968 massacre. The point of the map was really quite simple, right? To make transparent the processes of militarization that had gone hand in hand with Hawaii's transformation into a so-called paradise. That these occurred in lockstep was suggested by these final words at the bottom, paradise in the Pacific for genocide in Indochina. This map represents the kind of radical critiques against the war and U.S. empire that were emerging in Hawaii during this period. And on the one hand, it would be easy for us to interpret this activism as a peripheral part of the mainstream U.S. anti-war movements. But if we expand our view and situate our view beyond a U.S. framework, it becomes apparent that the struggles in Hawaii were actually part of the growing insurgencies of the decolonizing Pacific. In the Philippines, Okinawa, Japan, and elsewhere, anti-military movements were ascendant in the 1960s. Base workers, American GIs, labor and anti-war organizers forged critical and difficult alliances in an effort to end the war in Vietnam and their government's complicity with U.S. imperialism. These were all subjects of the U.S. empire who were radicalized by the war and struggled for a different conception of freedom that did not require their participation in U.S. state violence. So I end the book with these accounts of these Transpacific movements in order to show how U.S. militarism in Asia and the Pacific and the broader U.S. imperial project of securing an Asia for Asians had the unintended consequence of radicalizing the unfinished struggles for decolonization that were foreclosed. I'll end there. Thank you. Give you the.
I want to start off by thanking Mary and the Center for the Study of Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration for this invitation. It's wonderful to share the floor with Simeon, to meet so many students working in Asian American studies, to see many of my teachers in the room, and to celebrate ERNM's 20th anniversary. Almost 12 years ago, when I began my research on transnational activism surrounding the history of Japanese military sexual slavery, I asked elderly Korean survivors of wartime sexual violence why they attended the 27-year-long weekly protest held across from the Japanese embassy in Seoul, South Korea. One woman, Girwonok Harmony, the word for grandmother in Korean, explained that it was for the future. As a living witness, she believed that it was her responsibility to tell the world about her experiences and to fight for justice. Girwonok was a teenager in 1940 when she was deceived into becoming a sex slave for Japanese troops in northeast China. Like Girwonok, girls and young women from Japan's colonies and occupied territories endured unspeakable violence during their captivity in what were essentially rape camps. These so-called comfort stations could be found throughout Japan's colonies and occupied territories in China, the Philippines, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Island. For almost 5 decades, personal and public silence shrouded this history until Korean survivors began coming forward in the 1990s and galvanized the then nascent social movement for redress. Activists have pursued political and legal redress that has centered on the Japanese government's acknowledgement of Japanese military sexual slavery, an official apology, and reparations. Alongside the work of activists, artists have been using various cultural forms, from literature and visual art to the performing arts, to engage with the history of Japanese military sexual slavery. To this day, the Japanese government continues to deny survivors full reparative measures, despite the agreement in 2015 between the governments of South Korea and Japan to try to, quote, resolve, end quote, the issue. In response to a long history of state denials and half-hearted apologetic innuendos, a vibrant transnational network of local activists has organized throughout Asia, Europe, and the United States. In my book, I show how the official erasure of wartime sexual crimes in which Japan and the United States participated after the war, and Japanese state denials of official redress inadvertently nurtured a transnational Asian/American movement of activism and artistic intervention. I argue that performance plays a central role in how survivors, activists, and artists have grappled with histories of sexual violence and the erasures of such experiences. The history of Japanese military sexual slavery, a history that centered on the violation of women's bodies, calls for re-presenting, mobilizing, and reinvesting those bodies with meaning through redressive acts such as protest, tribunals, theater, and memorial building. The book builds on the work of transnational Asian American studies scholars like Lisa Yonayama and Kathleen Schlen-Viles in extending Lisa Lowe's framework of the, quote, tireless reckoning, end quote, with America's imperial past to Transpacific cultural practices of memory and justice. In the case of the government history, this reckoning has to contend with what Yonayama calls the, quote, Transpacific arrangement of Cold War justice, end quote. Japanese state denials of the government history tell only part of the multinational silencing of Japanese wartime criminality. And the United States is implicated in official post-war erasures of sexual war crimes during the Tokyo war crimes trials, inadequate post-war settlements for Japanese war crimes, and involvement in the afterlife of militarized sexual labor and violence in Japan and South Korea from 1945 to the present. By focusing on live public enactments and interactions between performers and audiences, I probe more deeply into the embodied aspects of remembrance and how the everyday of activism and artistic work can become a site of vibrant change that confronts the amnesia of transnational politics. The public embodiment of memory and its relation to community formation are important to my study. The women's acts of remembrance are central to their public activism. Communities of remembrance are also sustained and nurtured by the involvement of non-state actors in activism, theater, and memorial building. As Viet Thanh Nguyen writes, quote, "Given the scale of so many historical traumas, it can only be the case that for many survivors, witnesses, and inheritors, the past can only be worked through together in collectivity and community, in struggle and solidarity," end quote. Nguyen draws attention to the necessity of a transgenerational accounting of historical traumas for many survivors, witnesses, and inheritors. Communities of remembrance may be disparate in their identification, politics, and strategies, yet they are connected by the actions of remembrance in the pursuit of justice. For the rest of my talk, I'm going to focus on the redressive potential of memorial building by Koreans and Korean Americans in Seoul and Glendale, California. In recent years, as more of the elderly survivors pass away, activists are focusing on memorialization efforts. Stone and bronze memorials to comfort women can be found all over the world. Locations range from Manila, the Miyako Islands in Japan, Palisades Park, New Jersey, Glendale, California, Toronto, Canada, Nanjing to Sydney. Seoul is home to the original Bronze Girl statue, the most well-known comfort women memorial, and the majority of Bronze Girl statues have been installed in South Korean cities. Outside of South Korea, the largest concentration of comfort women memorials is in the United States. Glendale is home to the first Bronze Girl statue outside of Korea. And I'm interested in embodied engagements with these memorials and what these performances can tell us about the interrelationship between sexual violence, memory, performance, and transnational politics. These Bronze Girl memorials are examples of what Robin Bernstein calls scriptive things. She writes, quote, "A scriptive thing like a play script broadly structures a performance while allowing for agency and unleashing original live variations that may not be individually predictable," end quote. In the case of comfort women memorials, as scriptive things, they invite not just individual, but collective engagement in the ethical work of remembering histories of sexual violence. I look at memorials as scriptive things that invite what I call performances of care, or embodied acts that materialize concern and interest by providing for the needs of or looking after what one is caring for, in this case, memorials. The materiality, design, and location of memorials shape how they prompt or invite behaviors of care as scriptive things. Dressed in a hanbok, a traditional Korean dress, the realistically rendered barefoot bronze adolescent sits next to an empty bronze chair. The bronze girl sits stoically with clenched fist and closed lips. She stares straight ahead at the Japanese embassy in an accusatory manner, though one could also read a sense of peace and self-possession in her stillness. Her body language conveys defiance and confidence. Her head is held high and her back is straight. The statue's shadow is laid out in a mosaic of flat gray granite stones behind her that outlines the silhouette of a seated woman. The bent back and bun of the silhouette mark her as elderly. The statue is located on a sidewalk directly across from the front gates of the Japanese embassy in Seoul, where the weekly Wednesday demonstrations take place. The location of the statue allows multiple audiences to view the statue, the Korean public, the international public, and the Japanese state. The artist who created the statue and the South Korean public colloquially refer to the statue as the Sonyeosang, or girl statue. In naming her the girl statue, supporters anthropomorphize the memorial. They refer to the statue as her and perform actions of caring for it by dressing the statue when it is cold or leaving gifts and letters for the statue. The act of sitting by the statue's side, wrapping clothes around it, or leaving gifts literalizes keeping alive the issue and memory of these women while giving people a chance to perform care and to demonstrate their public support. And this is a collage of, on the top, the different outfits of the bronze girl statue. And in the lower right-hand corner, you'll see the statue in different positions. So these statues in various positions are throughout South Korea. And it's fascinating to see the ways in which the public finds creative means to care for the bronze girl. The bronze girl statue's presence has also re-scripted the Wednesday demonstrations. In the summer of 2007, when I first participated in the protest, on average, 8 to 10 survivors attended the demonstrations. Last summer, when I attended the Wednesday demonstration, only one survivor was in attendance. She sat not too far away from the bronze girl statue, which may soon be the only survivor presence at the protest. The bronze girl statue as an effigy, as defined by Joseph Roach, quote, fills by means of surrogation a vacancy created by the absence of any original, end quote, while also marking the impossibility of completely filling that absence. Moreover, the memorial as scriptive thing invites and reminds the public of their role in remembering the women and continuing their legacy. The presence of the bronze girl alongside the lone survivor powerfully highlights that we are at a critical juncture. There is an urgent need to transfer memory to the next generation. As part of that transmission of memory, Korean American communities are increasingly turning to memorial projects as powerful redressive acts. On July 30th, 2013, hundreds of mostly Korean Americans and local non-Korean politicians gathered in Central Park in Glendale to unveil the first Comfort Women Memorial built on public land on the west coast of the United States. Organizers of the Korean American Forum of California worked with Glendale City Council members to build this memorial, which was funded by members of Korean American communities in the Los Angeles area. Different Korean American civic organizations across the states have taken up the cause of Comfort Women and installed memorials in their communities. While these memorials offer the public an opportunity to remember survivors and their fight for justice, they are also examples of how the appeal of the Comfort Women issue mobilizes political energy for other causes in Korean American communities, such as building political alliances, increasing a voter base, or expressing a group identity. For many Korean Americans, commemorative practices express a Transpacific affinity for the Comfort Women cause that is truly rooted in a belief in social justice. Others see the memorials as a way to express Korean nationalistic claims or to assert their identity as a U.S. citizen. The lines are not always clearly demarcated between these different and sometimes problematic motivations. The dedication ceremony in Glendale was a carefully orchestrated event that helped frame the memorial as a nonpartisan issue that cuts across national and ethnic differences. And I'm going to focus on one particular speaker. Kathy Masako of Nikkei for Civil Rights and Redress discussed her group's 10-year grassroots campaign to win redress from the U.S. government for the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. Expressing her organization's support for the Comfort Women survivors, she voiced the importance of an apology and reparations. Quote, "When Japan sincerely apologizes and pays its reparations to each of the Comfort Women before it's too late, it will help these survivors heal and show that Japan has learned from its past," end quote, said Masako. Quote, she continues, "This monument for the Comfort Women has also reminded all of us that the abuse and trafficking of women into forced prostitution or domestic slavery continues today, even in this country," end quote. She placed the Comfort Women Memorial within the context of a larger discourse on violence against women, noting that it happens even in this country. Her comments raise an important question about what is forgotten when the experience of comfort women are remembered, through memorials like the one in Glendale. The plaque for the memorial invokes the never again mantra common to memorials to mass violence. Quote, and this is from the plaque, "It is our sincere hope that these unconscionable violations of human rights shall never recur," end quote. However, there is no mention during the ceremony of how these violations of human rights might be occurring in the sex trafficking of laborers into the Los Angeles area or in the sex industries near U.S. military bases in Asia. Perhaps these absences are invoked in the empty chair situated on U.S. soil. As Lisa Yonayama writes, quote, "The marked absence signified by the empty chair placed next to the statue of the girl unsettles viewers by reminding us of other injuries from state violence that remain equally unseen and unheard," end quote. Survivor Kim Bokdong's speech was the most powerful performance I witnessed that day. Dressed in a hanbok with a white jogori top and black chima skirt, she was the living embodiment of the bronze girl. Her dress, in the style and color of young girls' outfits during the time that she was taken, was both a reminder of her age when she was forced to become a sex slave and a powerful gesture of reclamation of that lost time. Elegantly clad and speaking in clear, steady words, she declared, quote, "As I've been traveling, I have been saying that if Japan does not come forward and apologize, then I will go around the world and build memorials," end quote. Building a memorial is both a call for redress and an act of redress itself. She continues to say, quote, "The memorial is a representation of the past history, so I ask you to try to protect and maintain the peace memorial here," end quote. She invoked the language of protection. In extending an invitation for others to join her in her fight for justice, she also articulated a broad horizon of peace that will ultimately be for future generations. The day after the dedication ceremony, I met the O family. They were from Riverside and had driven to Glendale to see the bronze girl statue. The son, a student at West Point, had come home for a visit, so the father decided that it would be a good idea for the family to see the statue together. And this is a quote from the father. "It seemed like a good opportunity to talk about Korean history. When I asked him how he felt after seeing the statue, he responded, quote, "Compared to when I read about it in newspapers, seeing it in person really moved it. Articles make it seem like someone else's story, but seeing the statue in person makes it seem like my story," end quote. I was struck by how the bronze girl statue made the comfort woman history more relevant and personal to Mr. O. Perhaps it was the lifelike design of the statue as an adolescent girl that resonated with him. Mr. O's son and daughter also seemed to be moved by the experience. The son spoke of how the statue brought history to life for him and made him feel a deeper connection to home. Quote, "Coming here and sitting around the dinner table and my parents telling me stories about their past, about their history, and coming out here brings it a lot closer to home, being able to visually see what they're talking about," end quote. Their sentiments were similar to what people say about meeting survivors in person or listening to their public testimonies. The Glendale statue, which is a replica of the memorial in Korea, is located on an open green facing west towards a group of tall trees. The statue and the chair are elevated 5 inches off the ground on a stone block that sits in the middle of a gravel clearing. The elevated position of the memorial discourages people from sitting in the chair, unlike the statue in Seoul, South Korea, across from the Japanese embassy. This likely also encourages people to treat the memorial like a shrine or grave. So instead of sartorial performances of care, which seem less necessary in Southern California's warmer weather, people in Glendale are more likely to leave bouquets, potted plants, and flowers and vases around the statue. The comfort memorials in Seoul and Glendale are not simply objects with static meanings. As scriptive things, these memorials invite behaviors that illuminate the range of attachments and feelings. people have about survivors and their cause. Through sartorial and horticultural performances of care, individuals and communities in Korea and the United States demonstrate how survivors have touched people's hearts and motivated them to engage with a difficult historical past. Approaching memorial building through the lens of performance illuminates the varied desires of Korean and Korean Americans that inform their commemorative practices. Those who dress the bronze girl care for the women who are sex slaves as young girls and genuinely want to honor their memory. Others see the memorials as symbols of geopolitical issues they are committed to fighting for. Some see a Korea of the past that they want to protect the memory of. And others, like the Japanese American activists in Glendale, connect the memorials to a larger fight to eradicate sex trafficking. Through interactions with memorials, such as performances of care, people become part of Transpacific communities of remembrance. They are commemorating not only the wartime experiences of survivors, but also their brave activism. The act of sitting by the statue's side, wrapping clothes around it, or leaving gifts provide people with the chance to participate in something larger than themselves and to share the comfort history with others while honoring the women. These performances of care remind us of the vitality of everyday acts of redress. Thank you.
Thank you for your beautiful books and beautiful talks. I was wondering if I was noticing how the two of you were thinking about Transpacific as both an imperial designation, but also a site of contestation for alternative Transpacific ties. And I was wondering if you would comment on that and maybe think about the gendering of the Transpacific in the ways you're both using them in terms of soldiering on the one hand and care on the other.
Mm-hmm. So I'm interested in thinking about the Transpacific in a very specific moment, right, of the post-1945, post-World War II U.S. projects in Asia, and really looking at using the Vietnam War as a site to think about the connections of all of these different countries and territories that we otherwise don't see the commonalities of. So it's certainly an imperial project of trying to demonstrate, right, how the U.S., even though it's trying hard to separate and distance itself from the Japanese empire of the past, right, it's still very much using the rhetoric of an Asia for Asians, of the East Asia co-prosperity sphere. But at the same time, we do see that this is a project that fails in many ways, in the sense that it kind of mobilizes these unforeseen alliances and interactions among different racialized colonial subjects, right? Not only among soldiers and civilians, but base workers, right? So one thing that I don't really dwell on in the book, but it's certainly a part of this making of the Decolonizing Pacific, is the alliances that we see between kind of anti-war, anti-military activists and sex workers at U.S. bases in the Philippines, in Korea, in Okinawa, and Japan, right? So in that sense, I see the gendering of the Transpacific as not only about creating a masculinist project of that's rooted in the labor of soldiering, but it's also about how the military is mobilizing different gender in a very different, in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about the Pacific both as a political, social, and cultural space. Thinking first about in terms of the Transpacific as an imperial project, I followed the women and how in the years leading up to and during World War II, if we track their movement throughout the Pacific, it's fascinating to see decades later how the women as activists recirculate along those paths, but as a way to create a different kind of space, a space of potentiality for reimagining what redress looks like for the women. Today I didn't get a chance to really talk about in depth about theater, but what's fascinating about theater productions about the comfort women is that many of them have a transnational production history. So, for example, there was a play, the first Asian American play about the comfort women in the United States by Chung Mi Kim, called Comfort Women, was picked up by a Korean director. She had read a review in Korean, then contacted the playwright to translate and to bring this play to Korea. And it ended up having an extended run throughout Korea. And what's fascinating is how this play then also traveled from Korea to Canada. So for me, it's fascinating to kind of think about not only the movements of the women across different times, but also how cultural producers are circulating between different spaces to create a redressive arena where people can re-engage with the issue.
Thank you.
Thanks for these terrific papers, really eye-opening and moving. My question is about the imperial move into pre-existing structures. In Indochina, the French colonial structures. In the case of post-World War II, the movement of the United States military into the structures created by the Japanese military, almost in some cases, if I've read your work correctly, with a kind of seamless transition, and the way in which that part of the history activates a relationship of colonialism with a deeper historical root. And I just wondered if you'd care to comment on that.
Yeah. So in Japan, after the end of World War II, there were various sex industries that were developed around military bases, one particular place in Okinawa. And what's interesting about these structures that were built earlier is that some of the women who were comfort women during World War II, many of them decided not to return back to their home countries. So some of them ended up staying at some of these camps and then serving US soldiers. And what's fascinating is that in my research, I noticed that this history has only come up when people talk about this tribunal that was held in 2000, the Women's International War Crimes Tribunal, which was a people's tribunal organized by various legal scholars and women's advocacy organizations around the world to bring together 64 comfort women survivors to redress the failings of the Tokyo tribunal. And what's fascinating is that during that tribunal, and especially during there was the main tribunal, and then there was a public hearing on contemporary acts of violence against women, is when they explicitly talked about the violence, the ongoing militarized violence against women in Okinawa. And it was during those presentations that legal scholars and activists were making these explicit connections between these different structures of violence. But it's interesting to see how that history often is submerged and not discussed in these different arenas of either theater or public testimony or memorial building.
Yeah, so it's really interesting to think about how the US is actively disavowing its imperial projects, right, and actively distancing itself from Japanese and European imperial powers before World War II. So one of the things that I'm trying to do in this book is to really show the ways in which, right, contrary to how like Cold War histories are narrated, that 1945 really did not mark a drastic break from the colonial past and the US kind of post-colonial present or post-World War II period. And one of the ways that we see the continuation of kind of the ongoing legacies of Japanese imperialism is in kind of the desires of Korean subjects, right, to join the military. Many of the recruits who were recruited into the US, into the Korean constabulary right after World War II were people who had previously been trained or had been officers in the Japanese Imperial Army. So there's a continuation not only like in terms of structures, right, structures of colonialism, but also in kind of thinking about the desires of colonial subjects themselves.
I have a partially formed question. Oh, I'm sorry. Did somebody else have their hand raised? No? Okay. I have a partially formed question that I think brings the work back into the United States proper, in terms of, because so much of the work is out there in the Pacific, and we're tracing these different mappings that the two of you are bringing to the field, which are amazing. But I'm sort of struck by Glendale and sort of, Southern California. And I'm thinking about how is the work that you're doing helping us rethink something like Glendale, Is there a way in which that we can, as scholars in the field of Asian American studies, need to think about the local in a very different way, based on these mappings that you're showing us? So I feel like that's what you're partially doing for us, and I wanted to hear a little bit more about that. Yeah.
Let's see, where to begin? I think for me, what's interesting is, as a transnational Asian/American performance scholar, it's fascinating when I look at a place like Glendale, because what I notice is that I think to understand the phenomena of memorial building in Glendale, California, I think we have to maybe step back and think about a larger temporal time span. Because there's a way in which the dedication ceremony, as I mentioned, was, of course, highly scripted, wanted to present this like nonpartisan issue that people across the board were joining hands for and wanting to support the women. But what's fascinating is that the organization behind the memorial was also a number of individuals who are at the forefront of the efforts in the states to pass H.R. 121 in the U.S. House of Representatives, which was the first resolution passed in the United States where the United States called Japan to apologize and to acknowledge what happened to the women. And what's fascinating about that particular resolution is that it was not only a coalition of various Asian American activists and organizations across the country, but it was a transnational effort that also, where individuals here in the States collaborated with organizations in Korea to have some of the survivors come and testify before the U.S. House of Representatives. So I think that it's kind of important to kind of think about the different histories behind the actual culminating events of Glendale. But what's fascinating to me is that I've been kind of tracking what's been happening in Glendale. One of the fascinating things for me is that, and I don't understand Southern California climate, but the bronze girl statue is no longer bronze. She's now become rusted and it almost has a greenish tinge, which is kind of interesting. And it's just fascinating how that space has not only become a place where people come by and leave flowers on particular anniversaries, but it's now become a space for press conferences whenever there's like a big issue like the 2015 deal between the South Korean government and the Japanese government. But it's also the space where people will hold rituals and funereal-like services for survivors who have passed away in Korea. So it's fascinating how that very localized space of this park that's between a senior citizen's home and the public library, if we kind of look at it through the lens of performance, we get to see ways in which the space has this history that is connected not only to ongoing politics in the States to advocate for these women, but it's connected to what's happening abroad. And for me, it's fascinating to kind of think about rituals and commemorating the women long after they have passed away in relation to the ongoing quest for redress for these women. So that's kind of my long, roundabout way of kind of answering your question about the ways in which that very localized space, it just has so many fascinated, sedimented meanings for national politics and then transnational politics of memory.
It's really interesting you brought up Kathy Maselka, who was one of the speakers, because she also appears in my project as an anti-war activist in the 1960s. So I guess to answer your question, I see both Asian American GIs and veterans and anti-war activists in Little Tokyo, in like wherever in the United States, really making sense of what was going on in their local communities, right, through the language of U.S. imperialism and state violence in Vietnam, right? So, I mean, that's a familiar story in kind of the civil rights, Black Power, Asian American movements, right? The ways in which state violence overseas became a way to really frame and understand what was going on with urban renewal, with policing, right? But also I see kind of domestic space, foreign space as really like the boundaries of that being incredibly blurred, right? And we definitely see that in the case of Hawaii, where the militarized, racialized training practices in Oahu had a direct correlation to the kinds of violence in Vietnam, right? We can also talk about Camp Pendleton in Southern California and the ways that, right, the racialized training practices there with the more recent wars had a direct relationship with state violence overseas. So I see it's a different way of making sense of like what we think of as domestic spaces, right? That it's always tied to imperial projects elsewhere.
Hi, I have a question for Professor Sami. I was really struck by your reading of the empty chair in the Bronze Girl Memorial as potentially an invitation to think about solidarities and alliances that can be forged between the comfort women movement and other sorts of forms of state violence. I'm thinking about the Comfort Women Memorial that was recently constructed in San Francisco that has 3 women sort of holding hands. For those of you who aren't familiar, a Korean woman, a Chinese woman, and I think a Filipino comfort woman, which is a different sort of way of constructing that kind of public memory. So I would love to hear your thoughts on the ways that these different forms of sculptural commemoration invite different kinds of political possibilities that might exceed, as well as bring back into focus the issue of comfort women redress.
Yeah. So to my knowledge, the San Francisco Comfort Women Memorial, the trio, is the only comfort women memorial that materializes this image of solidarity. And what's fascinating about that particular memorial is that it's located in Chinatown, but it's in St. Mary's Park, which is a public park. And it's fascinating to see the coalition work across ethnic boundaries to make that particular memorial fascinating. And when I visited last year, what struck me about that particular memorial is the ways in which it invites the pedestrian to also move in this circular movement, right? Because you're walking around and also, most importantly, looking up at the women in a position of veneration. But what was fascinating about the time when I visited is that if you looked across, and I forget which direction it was, but it's across the street, there's an art school. And on the wall of the art school, maybe you saw it, was a flag, the imperial Japanese flag. So fascinating to kind of think about within that one space how you have different conflicting ideas around that particular time, right? And what it means to remember World War II. But I think that particular trio of memorials is, I mean, for me, what really struck me about that memorial is not only is it a trio of 3 different comfort women on a pedestal, but there is a statue of Kim Hak-sun Harmony. So she's the first Korean woman who came forward on August 14, 1991. And what's fascinating is that she is standing and she's looking at this trio. So it raises this interesting question about time and also about the intergenerational reckoning of this particular history. And that kind of duality between the young girls and the older grandmother figure is something that is repeated in the bronze girl statue that I talked about, where behind the bronze girl statue, you see the mosaic of an elderly woman. And that iconography of the young girl and the grandmother figure has been used throughout the social movement, particularly in South Korea, in terms of the rhetoric that's used at protests, but also in the actual visual iconography in terms of images on banners.
Actually, I have a question for you, if you don't mind.
Yeah. And it's interesting. And then I have a comment.
Okay. So I was really interested also in the memorializations in the U.S.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if there are locations in the U.S., in Glendale and New Jersey, right, invited a kind of, a different kind of critique among Korean Americans about the role of the U.S. in perpetuating the system of sexual slavery, like after World War II. Like if that contradiction of having these memorials in the U.S. ever came up.
Yeah. So the first memorial on public land on the East Coast was in Palisades Park, New Jersey, outside of the public library. And in my interviews with various people involved in that particular memorial project, and also my attendance at a dedication ceremony, people did not express this kind of criticism and indictment of the U.S. And it did not surprise me that, of course, in the dedication ceremony, that would not be expressed, because part of the possibility of even having the memorial on public land meant that there was coalition building between Korean Americans and non-Koreans. But what I found fascinating about that particular memorial is the backlash, how a number of Japanese politicians came to visit the mayor, Mayor Rotundo, to say what these people are saying, it's historically false. Why would this little city get involved in this particular issue? You know, we want to give you all these gifts of cherry trees if you will remove the memorial. And the mayor famously said, you can keep your cherry trees, we're keeping our memorial, and we did our research. Wow. So it's fascinating how this particular memorial kind of has taken on this life in this community, because after that particular incident, and it was reported in, of course, a number of different Korean newspapers, that kind of unleashed this memorial building effort across the states, where different Korean American organizations were saying, we're going to build our own memorial.
Wow.
But interestingly enough, this kind of critique I have not encountered as much during these kind of public ceremonies. But I find this critique in cultural work like theater. That this theater becomes the space where people are able to talk more about not just U.S. complicity in what happened, but also are able to talk about Korean complicity in what happened. So for me, just the comment and kind of the connection is, it's fascinating that the comfort survivors have become advocates for other women who are survivors of gender-based violence. So 2 survivors started something called the Butterfly Fund in 2013, where when they would go and testify, they would collect funds, and different organizations would raise money so these women could support victims of other gender-based violence. And one group of women they supported were Vietnamese women who are survivors of sexual violence committed by Korean soldiers during the Vietnam War. And what's fascinating is that a number of the government activists from the main organization have been going to Vietnam to collect public testimony. And what's fascinating is that they're using some of the same rhetoric they used to advocate for redress from the Japanese government to now advocate for redress for these Vietnamese women from the Korean government. And just fascinating to see the kind of entanglement between these different histories of gender-based violence, but ways in which also it's not just in the structures of violence, it's also in the different modes of political organizing.
Right. Yeah, I remember seeing that exhibit at the Women's Human Rights Museum in Seoul, where the last exhibit at the time was a special exhibit devoted to this issue, and I thought it was so powerful that it expanded the issue and also critiqued like Korean state violence during the war.
I think this is so this was a treat to get to see you two talk to each other. So I think this is a great place to end. Let's give a wonderful round of applause.